So we're 2 years on from the referendum. Are we kind of edging towards the Brexit that you always dreamed of?
It's a curious process, the negotiations with the European Union. I mean, I negotiated with them in the early 2000s, and one of the key people I worked with was someone called Michel Barnier, who,
really?
of course, is now the key
Very
negotiator.
familiar name from us now.
And what I learned there is that the negotiations will always go up to the wire. It's the deadline. So unless you have a deadline, nothing gets agreed. But the two things which I think we mustn't lose sight of is, on the one hand, so far the EU has achieved its strategic goals. And that was to make the process of leaving as long-winded, as complicated and as painful as possible. We, on the other hand, our strategic goals seem to be to keep the Tory party together. And this is about more than that. This is about the national interest. And if what some people are concerned about is uncertainty, then surely getting to a point where we end the uncertainty and are clear about leaving, the better for all, whether you're a Remainer or a Leaver.
So do you think that Theresa May is more worried about her own party discipline than the Brexit deal?
Well, she needs to be worried about the party discipline because that's what she requires to implement the government policy. But now that we have the withdrawal bill, it's gone through Parliament, and we know we're negotiating heads of agreement, we must have a withdrawal treaty which is clear about the broad principles.
I have to pick up on your point that you negotiated alongside Michel Barnier. How was he? Because he seems like an extraordinarily tough negotiator from an outsider's point of view.
Well, he's a good man. He's a decent man, but at heart he is a Gaullist. So I think in private he probably sheds fewer tears about the United Kingdom leaving than you might think, other than, and this is important, the European Union is losing its second largest net contributor. So the automatic payments are one of our greatest bargaining tools, and therefore Theresa May must not agree on anything that doesn't bring together our payments and broad agreements.
But hasn't that already been given away?
No, she hasn't, because at the moment we talk about, we said we make contributions, but the withdrawal treaty will be more precise. And whilst people talk about, transition periods, I think there must be implementation periods.
Let's talk about the transition period, because it feels to me, all the interviews that I've done recently, politicians seem to be laying the ground for a longer transition. I spoke to Liam Fox last weekend. He said that he'd be happy for the transition to be extended in certain circumstances. Greg Clark, who we'll hear from shortly, effectively says the same thing. Jeremy Corbyn, in the interview that we've just heard, he says that he would also accept a longer transition period. I mean, for some people who voted leave, they'll be looking at this thinking, are we ever going to leave the EU?
And this is where you have to inquire into people's motives. As far as I'm concerned, and I think probably most people who voted leave and some who voted remain, they say, if we leave and we know how we're going to leave, then if that takes a bit of time, that's fine. But we must be clear on the terms on which we are leaving. So if you spell out precisely what the agreement is, and then someone comes back and says, in order to make this happen, it'll take us a little bit longer, then people will say, that's fine. But a lot of people who talk about extending negotiations, extending those periods, they just don't want us to leave at all. And they hope that what you can make temporary will become permanent. So the transition period is neither here nor there in one sense, provided you start with clear heads, which you have agreed.
Talking about people who don't like the result of the referendum, many of them in your own party, it feels as if there is a growing momentum, to coin a word, to get a second referendum on the final deal. Momentum members voting to back this, many of them, Unite members accordingly, apparently doing the same. Are you worried that actually the Labour Party position may shift?
What I would say to both sides is that uncertainty is the one thing which concerns business in terms of investment. It's the one thing which many of the Remainers have criticised about the process so far. And I think that if your motive for calling for a second referendum is to delay and overturn the decision, then you do two things. You undermine democratic institutions because we promised a referendum and the Prime Minister said, whatever you decide, I will implement it. And also you increase delay and uncertainty. And I can't see how that could be good for anyone.
talking about the Jeremy Corbyn interview as well that we just listened to, one question that I asked him was whether Brexit was the problem or if it was the government's handling of Brexit. And he said it was the government's handling. So, there's been suspicions about Jeremy Corbyn. He, of course, denies it. But do you think that he has a certain sympathy towards, the Brexiteer cause?
All I can observe is that whilst by and large in the 20 years I always was a very loyal Labour Party backbencher, however, I tended to break rank when the word Europe was in legislation, and on those occasions Jeremy Corbyn tended to be in the same division lobby as me. That is the only... But I think there comes a moment where, irrespective of what you thought in the past and what you think of the government's handling, what struck me over the last 2 years, we seemed to stop talking about the future. We kept harking about all kinds of past deals. And my challenge to both the Cabinet but also to our front bench is, let's look ahead. The world around us is changing. Technology, trade deals, international conditions. Let's make the UK fit for the future. And that requires a little bit more confidence. And let's show it.
Now, you, of course, were the chair of Vote Leave. Lots of people have really criticised the campaign that Vote Leave ran. And, from, the £350 million to the NHS on the side of the bus that some people say is just simply not a correct figure. Also, if you look back at some of the Vote Leave press releases, they do seem slightly naive in tone, some of them. I mean, after we vote Leave, we would immediately be able to start negotiating new trade deals with the world's biggest economies. I mean, do you ever look back at the campaign and feel a bit uncomfortable and think, actually, you know what, we did oversimplify some things there?
But when you ask a question which are kind of constitutional questions, it wasn't if you'd had a referendum on, say, the Lisbon Treaty, where you could say, this is a treaty and this is what we have now. When you do it on those broad principles, I think the thing which we kept coming back to, and which is the real difference, is who do you think should make your laws? Who do you think should do your trade deals?
I understand that those were the arguments that you made during that campaign, very eloquently, but did you not feel a bit uncomfortable at some of the other people around you in the campaign and the way that they did seem to be simplifying some of those arguments?
I think when you run a campaign, all you can ever do is focus on what you say. And Vote Leave, we were very careful with, for example, language and immigration. We never talked about numbers. We actually always said the system should be the same whether you're EU citizens or a non-EU citizen. We actually talked closer towards the end of the campaign about an Australian-style point system, which is actually one thing Remainers and Leavers seem to agree on. And we had to take people to talking about things we haven't talked about for 40 years. And remember, members of Parliament haven't talked about trade deals and trade negotiations for 40 years.
Well, they're making up for it now, certainly. There's lots of things in the papers today as well about Conservative leadership battles. So just before you go, I'm keen to get your thoughts on two people whose names are often mentioned, two people you worked very closely with at Vote Leave, Boris Johnson and Michael Gove. Do you think either of them are Prime Minister material?
Well,
Straight answer, come on.
It's the process of the campaigns which will mettle whoever it is. But I have to say that I've enjoyed working with both of them, and I don't think their public image does them justice.
OK, thank you very much.